When somebody asks you if you're a god, do you want to be able to say yes? Find out how when we talk about the Dungeons and Dragons Immortal set tonight on the Old Dragoon. Welcome to the Old Dragoon. Tonight, we're talking about the final box set in the BECMI Basic Expert Companion Masters Immortals line of role-playing games from TSR in the 80s. The BECMI line revised the BX line, which in turn revised Holmes Basic, and was the version of D&D that I came into the hobby on. So the ampersand you're looking at right now is the one tattooed on my arm, and these sets of books were the ones that I dug into when I first got into D&D. And I will tell you, when we hit the Immortals books, because we never hit the levels to get to immortality, we all tried to read these books, and it confused the daylights out of us. Now, granted, we were middle schoolers, but I've taken another look at the Immortals set, and we're going to talk about what I found. So, here we go. Alright, so we've got the Player's Guide to Immortals. Like all of the box sets except the Expert set. This comes with 2 books, one for players and one for DMs. So, the Player's Guide to Immortals. This book is shorter than you might think. It's actually only a 32-page book, and it covers, I don't want to say the basics of immortality because it does get into the deep weeds pretty quick, but let's talk about what's in here. This completely changes the Dungeons and Dragons game. You are largely no longer going to be delving dungeons or ruling the domain that you created when you hit name level or anything like that. Things get different and far more powerful real quick. So, what do you do as an immortal, really? I mean, what's the game about? In a discussion that we had with Frank Mincer at North Texas RPG Con, he sort of said that that was kind of the thing, is it's a completely different game and really not a continuation of D&D as it was played to that point. It's a very different point of view. The characters are completely different beings than the mortal D&D characters that players are used to playing. And so some people did have difficulty transitioning to the Immortals rules. And you'll see why here in a minute. Now, I will also say, while these rules can sometimes be very different, very complex, and the cosmology thrown at you is unusually deep for what you call a basic game line. I mean, BECMI really grew into something that was just as comprehensive as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, more so in a couple of cases. But it was still called the basic D&D line. And when we get to cosmology in the Dungeon Master's book, you'll see what I mean by holy crap. So, let's take a look. Section 1 is appropriately titled Changes, because holy crap, is the game different. Then we go into new character information, immortal magic, which is on a whole nother level than mortal magic, while still using many of the mortal magic spells and spell effects. Character advancement, you still have levels. You will still go up levels. There are levels of immortality. And then your home plane. The neat thing is, when your character ascends to immortality and makes it out of their sort of training and apprenticeship phase, each of them will be given a home plane. And that is the place where their immortal being returns to sort of take a load off. That is your home plane, and your powers are greatest within your home plane. However, if you're destroyed on your home plane, you're destroyed. If you die anywhere else, you rematerialize on your home plane, which is interesting. So, Menser starts out by explaining what the changes are going to be like, how this is different. Is your character dead? Did they just continue in existence? What happened to their body when they ascended to immortality? Those kind of things are covered in this first portion. Now, some of these concepts, like how to become immortal, are introduced in the previous 2 box sets, in the Masters and Companion sets. And so this kind of gives you a refresher on some of those. In fact, there's some errata later on fixing some of the things in the older box set so that it jives with what's in this set. You also find out that you're going to be an immortal of one of the spheres: matter, energy, time, thought, or entropy. Except you can't be an immortal of entropy. Those are exclusively NPCs and exclusively bad guys. But that's one of the spheres. So, one thing to remember is that immortals are not gods. They fill that place within the cosmology, especially in the Mystara setting, which is default to the BECMI rulebooks. So these are the creatures that mortals tend to worship. They are treated the way we think of early cultures treating their gods. In fact, in the Northern Reaches, the immortals are quite literally some of the Norse gods. Even though they're not the Norse gods, they take on the names and the visage and the personalities, but they're not actually the Norse gods. When we get around to the Northern Reaches, we'll talk about that. But sufficient to say, the immortals are ridiculously powerful compared to mortals, but they are not unkillable. They can be destroyed. So, Menser is careful to mention that modern beliefs have been avoided in creating this rule system. This is a game, not a collection of religious beliefs. Remember, this is at the height of the Satanic Panic, and so you have to be very careful when you're addressing these concepts. So let's move forward. All right, we're talking about experience points, which you've got a ton of at this point. Characters tend to ascend to immortality somewhere in the 30s. Remember that humans can go up to level 36 in BECMI D&D, and demi-humans, while they are limited to 8th level for halflings, 10th level for elves, and 12th level for dwarves, do continue to accumulate experience points and earn some abilities, though they don't earn additional hit points or true levels after that, like attack ranks or weapon mastery. So when your character becomes immortal, every 10,000 experience points becomes a power point. And power points are going to be the action currency of most immortals. So you're going to get an allocation of power points based on the experience points of your character when they ascended to immortality. You also have multiple forms, potentially. You can return to your original mortal body, which reconstitutes itself and is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the mortal body you possessed when you became immortal. But you can also change your physical form, create a new physical form. And there are spaces on the Immortals character sheets for 2 separate forms so that you can record how you interact with the material world. Names become very important to immortal characters. You will have a name that everyone knows, and then you will have a true name. And the true name actually expands as you gain power as an immortal. And knowledge of any portion of that name gives a being, mortal or immortal, some leverage over the mortal, some ability to hurt the immortal or control the immortal. And so true names are very, very closely guarded. Occasionally, portions of a true name will be exchanged in some sort of alliance. Basically, if we're going to work together, we exchange part of our true name so that neither of us can really screw the other over. I think that's a really fascinating idea. And I think the concept of a hapless mortal stumbling across the true name of an immortal might be hilarious, or an interesting situation. It reminds me of the episode of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends from the 80s where Doctor Doom is attempting to get godlike powers, and the powers are accidentally gifted to a guy named Mr. Frump. And he just kind of starts wielding these great powers to do all sorts of things. He turns the city polka dot. He wishes for all the money in the world, that kind of thing. It would be interesting to see a low level or possibly even unleveled character come across some portion of a true name and all of a sudden, realize that they can summon an immortal or command the immortal to do something for them. All right, so your race carries over with you into immortality. And alignment is said to be something that's a little less important as an immortal. And so you can change alignments without penalty once you're immortal. And you should probably pick an alignment that matches your character's behavior. Armor class. This threw me when I came back and read it, because when you initiate to immortality, when you're an initiate, that is your training period as an immortal, when you're getting your wings, right? And you're figuring out how to exist as an immortal, you get an AC of 0. As immortals become more powerful, they can spend power points to increase their armor class. The armor class goes numerically upward like a modern D&D game. So from 0 you go to 1, and then you go to 2, and then you go to 3. But when you're interacting with mortals, you turn that negative. So your armor class will then be, -2, -3, and so forth. You are granted a static number of hit dice and hit points when you become an initiate, and that goes up as you level as an immortal. And it's pretty scary how high those hit points go. And when you change back and forth to different forms, your hit point total can conceivably change, especially if you go back to your original mortal form. So, how fast do immortals move? Well, that's a very interesting question, because it depends on what form you take. The example tells you that an immortal that takes the form of a storm giant basically can move faster than a storm giant because of the base movement of immortals. And as we'll see later, immortals can also move, continents. They can move ridiculous distances on the material planes, or they could travel between the planes or between dimensions. It gets pretty mind-boggling. So immortals can raise their ability scores by expending power points, and those ability scores are capped depending on the level of immortal you are. As a starting out immortal, once you've got past your initiate stage and you are a established but still inexperienced immortal, your ability scores tap out at 25, and it goes up from there. So your ability scores take on slightly different effects once you become immortal. And the book explains exactly how those effects are different. But one of the really important ones is your wisdom and charisma give you an aura. The aura emanates from your immortal being. And when you are around mortals, that aura has an effect on all the mortals within it. You can cause it to become a super powerful charm. You can cause it to make them cower in fear. You can sort of do that thing that gods and servants of gods do in various myths, and cow or comfort the mortals. And the higher the charisma and wisdom, the more people you can affect. So, we move on. Immortals get talents that are linked to their sphere. So you'll have 3 ability scores. Think of these as sort of like prime requisites. You'll have 3 ability scores, a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary, that are linked to your sphere. And then the other 3 ability scores are lesser talents. On this page, you can see how much it costs for ability scores to go up and how high they can go. You can also sacrifice ability scores temporarily to convert them into power points. And I say temporarily because you get the power points and then you have to buy back the attributes. So it is sort of permanent unless you buy it off. So ability score checks. This is a new mechanic, and it kind of took me by surprise when I read it. I don't remember this from my first encounter with these books back when I was a middle schooler. But your ability score checks are percentile dice against your ability. Now, there are modifiers. If you take a look at the top of the center column, there are modifiers that you can add to your, say I'm a new temporal, I've got a charisma of 18, I'm doing an easy task, so that's going to add 55 to it. So now my effective percentile score is 73. So I'm going to roll percentile dice, try to get under 73. So that's how it works. You will use these percentile rolls to check against your ability scores. So that's kind of interesting. Saving throws have changed from when you were mortal. So saving throws change to different mechanics in some cases, so that you can get these different saving throws that didn't apply before when you were mortal. And there's some guidance on when to even use saving throws anymore at this point. So already, so many things have changed from the standard D&D game. So you don't keep any of the valuables that you owned when you were mortal. But you can accumulate or create treasures so that you can use them to interact with the mortal world, to buy off mortals, or to create a magic item and plant it somewhere so that a chosen hero can find it. It's interesting stuff. So, the spheres. Depending on how you became immortal, you will be assigned to one of the 4 legal spheres. Remember, you can't be entropy because those are only NPCs. We talked about this when we covered the companion rules, the path of the dynast, where you create an enduring dynasty, the path of the hero, where you accomplish an epic deed, The path of the paragon, where you kind of become the exemplar, and the path of the polymath, where you level up as several different classes and learn a little bit of everything. Those assign you to the different spheres, and they tend to favor a particular class. Matter favors fighters, energy favors magic users, time favors clerics, and thought favors thieves. You have a favored element. You have an aspect of your aura that is different from the other spheres. You have a particular purpose, the purpose of your sphere. This is what the sphere as a whole and all the immortals associated with it want to accomplish in the multiverse. And then your sphere will explain how it interacts with the other spheres. So having a mixed party of immortals from different spheres looks like it could be pretty interesting, because they won't always share the same goals in a given situation. And they may be forced to work with, but yet against each other in different ways. This brings up, well, almost any polytheistic legends. There's always tales of one god betraying another, or gods that are opposed to each other. And so that can happen here with your player group. That kind of edges this into Vampire the Masquerade territory, because, you know, a vampire coterie is usually made of vampires from different clans, but all the clans have their own aims, and so you are usually working both with and against your party. And that's how it looks like it would work here, unless for some reason the entire party is coming from one sphere. So, moving on. Immortals have the same senses as mortals, but also some additional senses that mortals do not have. Their senses are also much sharper. They also get anti-magic. Now this is a huge thing. Anti-magic, if you remember from the earlier box sets, is the ability to simply ignore magical effects. You get a percentile chance, you roll percentage against that chance. If you succeed, the magic simply does not take effect. Immortals can raise and lower their anti-magic at will, and they can expend power points to temporarily boost their anti-magic. So starting immortals have a 50% anti-magic. So a wizard or another immortal or somebody throws a normal arcane spell, like the kind an elf or a magic user would cast at you. You roll percentile dice, and if you roll a 50 or less, that spell simply does nothing at all. And if you spend the power points to raise it up to 100%, well, then mortal types of magic simply don't affect you. Anti-magic is extremely potent as far as, you know, if an immortal were to come down and seek retribution against Bargle for killing Alina the cleric, and Bargle attempts to throw, you know, his most powerful spells at the immortal to fend off his doom, the immortal is likely to just shrug off all of that magic. So that's pretty awesome. You recover power points when you spend them, as long as you don't spend them permanently, say to raise an ability score. And the rate at which they come back depends on the plane you're on. If the plane is friendly to you, you get lots of points back. If the plane is unfriendly to you, you get a trickle of points back. So if you are venturing onto a plane to, say, try to take out an entropy demon, an immortal of entropy that are classed as demons, and they do actually use the D word in this set, which I thought was interesting. If you are entering the lion's den in that way, you're going to have a hard time recovering. And so, you know, bear that in mind. You regenerate, and if you spend power points, you can regenerate faster. Immortals are very, very resilient. The book then goes on to explain the biases of the different planes. This is where things start to get a little hard to follow. My brain is still a bit scrambled from my heart surgery almost 2 years ago. Next month will be 2 years. So I don't have the concentration and recall that I had before the surgery. And so attempting to assimilate all of this, I've had to read it a couple of times, and I'm still not sure I've got all of it. But that's why we have the books, right? So we can go back to it. So we explain the bias of the different planes. We explain movement and how you can move through a plane and between planes. When you're moving on a plane that you just need to go somewhere really fast, every round you can cover 24 miles. So a travel hex on a large map, you can cover one hex every round. You can move ridiculously quickly. When you take material form, you can fly, you can turn gaseous, or you can move 40 feet around on whatever feet you create. And remember, you can also take a form of a creature and move slightly faster than that creature could normally move. So you can go places. You can move between planes, and you can move between dimensions. What's the difference between a plane and dimension? Well, that takes a lot of explaining. So dimensions are dimensions, right? The known dimensions that we know are length, width, and height, right? We have the three normal dimensions that we deal with. And then there's a hyperspace dimension that is expressed as, this is the dimension used for teleporting. It's a shortcut between other points. And then there is a fifth dimension called the dimension of nightmare. And that is something you really don't want to mess with. So, of course, DMs are going to send their players there, right? So, the game gets into explaining how dimensions interact and how things happen when you are below the 3-dimension level. So, in a plane that only has the 3 basic dimensions of length, width, and height, Immortals are going to have trouble using their power. When you add the hyperspace dimension, well, now their power works a little bit better. And the theory, because yes, this goes into theory, this goes into magical Stephen Hawking territory in the DM's book. You get an explanation about how, in order to perceive any creature or object, you must perceive it from at least one more dimension than the object possesses. So imagine a piece of paper. It is effectively 2-dimensional. Yes, it has height, but let's pretend for a moment it just has length and width. In order to observe that piece of paper, you must be in 3-dimensional space so that you can look at the paper from a distance and observe that it is only 2 dimensions. Yeah, this set gets into those kind of deep weeds, and holy hell, did it. Yeah, I read it several times. So dimensions and planes are 2 separate things, and you can freely travel between them with an expenditure of power points. You can also use gates, like the standard magic user gate spell. And we'll get into how you use mortal magic in a bit. In short, any immortal can use mortal magic, and doesn't matter if they were a magic user before they became immortal or not. They simply have the ability to call those effects into being for an expenditure of power points. How much it costs Depends on what kind of immortal you are. All right, so we're talking about movement in dimensions, and you can see there's a diagram on this page that actually shows you how to do like a complex diagram to measure distance between points in a multidimensional space. And I thought the thrust and travel time computations from Traveler were complex. This gets really deep, and in the text it even tells you, hey, being this pedantic about all of this is probably not something you want to do unless for some reason exact distances are vital to what you're doing. You see at the bottom that we've got a new set of order of events for Immortals. The intentions phase and the initiative phase are pretty close to what we're used to. But then there's a special combat phase where you can do aura combat or impose your aura upon the mortal creatures around you, or use power combat, which, again, we'll talk about in a minute. Aura attacks go off, then actions happen, and then you go through the steps for the side that lost initiative. So, you add a couple of layers to the standard D&D combat round. There are attack forms that Immortals can use that are things that mortals simply don't have access to. The aura is one that is kind of always on. You can suppress your aura, but most of the time, anytime you're interacting with mortals, they are going to be subject to your aura. You can make physical attacks with weapons. You can use your immortal fist and do quite a bit of damage that way. There's, of course, magical attacks. You can use magic. Power attacks are when you use your power points directly to attack another being. And then ability attacks allow you to try to decrease the ability scores of a opponent. So there's rules here for how the aura works. There's rules for how melee combat works for an immortal. We get into magical attacks. There is a spell table that shows what the cost of casting a particular spell is and how it's modified by the type of immortal you are. And then there's an explanation for how to use your power attacks. There is a basic and an advanced version of these rules, and they're pretty similar to each other. It just gives you a few more options. You can basically use your power to attack someone else, and if the attack is successful, you will erode their power by more than what you just spent. But if your attack is not successful, you've just spent some power points. You are closer to being tapped out. So this does kind of model some of the stories where, you know, immortal or godlike creatures are just throwing power back and forth at each other until they just become tapped out. And actually a good example of that. The combat between Gary Mitchell and Dr. Elizabeth Daner at the end of the second Star Trek pilot, the original TOS pilot. Remember, they cross the galactic barrier. Gary Mitchell gets super powerful, godlike psychic powers, and then shortly thereafter, Dr. Daner also receives those powers. And at the end of the episode, the two of them duke it out with their godlike powers. And you can see that they throw these massive attacks back and forth until they both start getting really tired. Think of that when you're thinking about power attacks. So, it explains the different ways power attacks work, and how they work, and what the combat results are. And there are two charts, one for the simple method, one for the advanced method, that tell you what the effects are of one character choosing a particular attack and the other character choosing a particular attack what happens. This kind of reminds me of a very simplified version of how the top secret role playing game that was released by TSR in 80 and revised in 81 handled hand to hand combat. There were result tables, and rather than rolling random hits, the result was calculated by okay, what kind of attack did this guy throw and what kind of defense did his opponent choose? You look it up on the table and you see what the net effect was. That's what happens here. Now, one of the things that is interesting about power attacks is how the actions take place and what exactly they do, and what is the defense against these things. The wrap defense doesn't actually defend all that much, but it does sort of envelop the target in your power. So I mean, it's something to take a look at if you decide to run Immortals. As I said, a lot of these rules get complicated pretty fast, but the more I look it over, the more I think, I want to try this sometime. I guess I need to run a campaign for 8 or 10 years so that people get up to 36 level. So you can attempt to erode ability scores. We covered that. And then we talk about immortal magic. Here's where you find out how Immortals use all of the magical effects that you're used to. There is sphere factors that multiply the base cost of a spell depending on what sphere of immortal you are. So some spells are going to be easier for you to use or less costly to cast than others. And there will always be one category that is going to cost an awful lot of your points to throw. So there's some deep weeds on exactly how this works, but that's the basics of it. There will be a base cost of a spell based on the level of that spell in Mortal Magic, and then you multiply it by the sphere factor and get a number of power points necessary to cast that spell. So you can manipulate the damage of spells based on what level of immortal you are. It's kind of cool. But you can never modify the damage dice to do more damage than the number of sides on the die. For instance, if you've got a +1 per die going in on a fireball, then the results of that are going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 6. So you can't go to 7, but you do have 2 chances to throw a 6. There's more information about how specific spell effects work. And then we get a list of all sorts of terms, many of which were used in Mortal D&D, but it explains kind of how they're changed. For instance, the bear hug from the wrestling rules. If an Immortal's form has more than 2 arms, any 2 may be employed in this effect. So it gives you some changes between the mortal world and the immortal world, and explains them all in alphabetical order. Very useful, very interesting, and for a DM, kind of inspirational. Sometimes when I read little snippets of things, I can hang an entire adventure off of just a short bit of text. And reading some of those effects made me go, I see how I could use this. I see how I could use this. Turning undead. If an immortal has the turning undead ability, they can use it much in the same way mortals do, but more. They can actually affect more undead than a mortal can, and make it quite a bit more potent than it was. So let's talk about character advancement. When you have 1,000 power points, you are eligible to move up to Celestial. At 2,500, you can move up from Celestial to Imperial. At 5,000, you can move up from Imperial to Eternal. And at 10,000, you can go for Hierarch. Now remember, each power point is 10,000 XP. So we're talking about ridiculous numbers of XP at this point. You're going to have to be doing a lot of immortal adventuring. And remember, you are now beyond the main source of experience points for mortal characters, which is gold pieces. In BECMI, 1 gold piece is 1 experience point, so you routinely earn many, many more XP for the treasure you bring home than you did for the creatures you've slain. Immortals get XP a little bit differently to earn their power points. So, one of the things that you have to also remember is when you are moving up in level, it's kind of like the early monk class or the early druid class, where as you got into the upper levels, you had to fight for the next level up. You couldn't simply level up. There were only a certain number of slots available. So in this version, you actually have to compete for the higher slots. Section 5 tells us how to create our home plane. So there is, according to the book, an infinite number of outer planes. So the hierarch assigns you a home plane, and that is basically the place where you and the DM, or maybe just the DM, create your home plane that your character normally exists upon when not doing anything else. So there's lots of things you can do with your home plane, and the forms that you appear in. And how you can become an avatar of your own immortal. And immortal PCs have the power to create artifacts. Now this could be pretty cool. Like I said earlier, one of the ideas I had was have an immortal create an artifact and plant it so that it will be found by mortal adventurers, and maybe even take on a mortal form to nudge the chosen adventurers in that direction. So here's the rank advancement chart for moving up as an immortal. If you look all the way over to the right, there is a population column. This is how many immortals of that level are allowed per sphere. And the numbers get smaller as you go up, with the exception of Initiate, which is capped at 7, because only a certain number of new immortals are in training at any given time. All the way up to Hierarch, where there is only 1. So, here are all the tables. Note that the ability score bonuses go up to 100. Your ability scores can go all the way up. And the charisma effects are also expanded for more retainers, better morale. You know, your retainers will fight to the death for you if their morale is above 12. It's interesting stuff. And it also imposes saving throw bonuses or penalties to your aura attack based on how charismatic you are. So there's an index to all the effects that you might try to create using mortal magic and what sphere they're attached to. So at that point, you can determine the multiplier for how many power points it's going to take you based on your own sphere. Oh, join the RPGA. And of course, there's an index on the back. That is the player's book. Let's take a look at the DM's guide. So, this is the book that'll really bake your brain, unless your brain is in better working order than mine. So, this is the thicker book. And it's only broken down basically into three pieces. Like an explanation of how the multiverse works, an explanation of what an immortal campaign should look like, because this is very different from standard D&D, and then a list of creatures that are appropriate to immortal level campaigns. So, this jumps into explaining how the BECMI multiverse works, and this is different from, say, the Manual of the Planes for AD&D. It explains the prime plane, which is where most of your mortal PCs are running around. It explains how dimensions work, and like I said, that can get pretty deep weeds in how the dimensions interact. And it talks about the beings that were the progenitors of the immortals, the old ones, that were more powerful than the immortals. Perhaps they were true gods. And that there was a limit imposed by the old ones to keep the immortals from becoming too powerful. Some illustrations of the planes that can be all sorts of different shapes. The ethereal plane is explained as sort of a sea that you can sail on to travel between other planes. And that if you basically travel far enough from the quote-unquote surface of the plane you're on, the ether will eventually appear and you will be on the ethereal plane and can travel through that to one of the other planes. So you can see the prime plane is sort of in the center of the cosmology with the elemental planes on the corners. But how does that affect things? This is the stuff that sort of blows my mind and makes me wonder exactly how I'd handle this if I were running an Immortals game. So, God, I say that a lot. We go over the characteristics of various planes, and they talk specifically about Earth. That took me by surprise, because I had always assumed that the known world, or Mystara, existed as its own world, and that Earth wouldn't really come into it. But fascinatingly enough, Earth, the real Earth, not only appears in the first adventure module that was released for the Immortals box set, but specific locations on Earth, and at a time period that I think will surprise you. No spoilers here. Maybe we'll talk about it in a video about that exact adventure module. And of course, there will be spoiler alerts on that. So DMs only if we get that far. For convenience, as the book says, the star system is basically a carbon copy of our own star system with a couple of changes. We get distances for travel. We talk about how far different stars are to us. And you also get a couple of interesting little bits of world building. There's a reference to Epsilon Eridani being the closest civilization that can use magic to Earth. But then there's a little snippet that says, oh, since the Age of Magic ended, implying that Earth itself had an Age of Magic. So we talk about astral, we talk about how magic is changed on the astral plane, how movement works. There is a nice random encounter table, and oh boy, when dragons appear as random encounters more frequently than they did in the old books, it's kind of scary. Black balls as random encounters. It's different. We'll put it that way. So there are listings for different kinds of creatures and how they exactly work. Orcus and Demogorgon appear here. And I think that's an interesting crossover both from AD&D and makes me wonder where the Stranger Things kids got their information on Demogorgon before this box set dropped. I'd have to go back and look. I don't think Demogorgon appeared by name in the BX series. So they probably pulled it from AD&D or maybe all the way back to the little saddle stapled books. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. You can generate planes, and you can generate planes randomly if you want to create some new planes. The planes can have different numbers of dimensions. Most of them will be 5-dimensional because that's kind of how Immortals roll. And that's how the planes that most D&D worlds will take place in, so that magic works and Immortals work and everything you're used to works. But there are increasingly rare planes with less dimensions. So you can see there's a table of exactly how common those planes are. You roll the contents the same way you roll treasure types. There are explanations of what exactly dimensions do to different factors in the game. The boundaries between planes and how to cross them. The boundaries on dimensions and how to cross them. And now we get into where we take a look at what should an Immortal campaign look like. The box at the bottom of this page is errata from the master set that is bringing it into line with what was written for Immortals. I had almost forgotten that these box sets were written individually and it wasn't originally all laid out and then released. So it kind of struck me as interesting when I saw this and thought, oh, well, they didn't know what those rules were going to be at the time they released that earlier set. So Immortals have goals. All Immortals have the 3 basic goals listed on the lower left corner of this page, and then you add the goals of your sphere. I like number 3 myself. So the 3 main goals of Immortals: to maintain existence and integrity of the prime plane and the creatures within it. So Immortals are there to make sure the world continues working as it should. To assist, protect, and develop the sphere that one serves, and other individuals, mortal or immortal, who serve the same sphere. So keep the universe working. Keep your sphere as ascendant as you can. And then 3, explore and develop the multiverse. Now that could be a very interesting campaign to go on. When your characters can skip from dimensions to dimensions, from planes to planes, and go anywhere, more or less at will, that could be a really cool, godlike Star Trek, more or less. You know, exploring strange new planes, seeking out new dimensions and new life forms. The game explains how the immortals interact with mortal society, how they create their avatars, their identities, their mortal abilities that they can take on to interact directly with the mortal realm. And here we get the idea of observers and controllers. So observers, to use another Star Trek reference, are kind of like the Federation folks in the duck blind that are observing a pre-warp society and just want to learn more about it. They don't want to interfere. They just want to observe and learn. Controllers are immortals that go down to a mortal realm and insinuate themselves into the action. They don't actually become leaders usually, and they don't actually do the thing themselves, but they nudge the mortals toward doing the thing. The greatest two examples that I can think of for this kind of interaction are Gandalf and Fizban. So Gandalf is himself more than mortal. He's not quite godlike, but he's more than mortal. Tolkien had the Valar and the Maiar as powerful beings that were more than mortal but weren't quite gods as such. Gandalf comes down, and where he goes, trouble follows. He insinuates himself into all the different situations and basically becomes a sort of guide, but conspicuously disappears in The Hobbit at particular points in the book, leaving the mortals to handle their own issues. In Lord of the Rings, after he's fought the Balrog and he comes back as Gandalf the White, he's much more directly active. But, Fizban the Fabulous, he's the avatar of the god Paladine. He comes down in the Dragonlance books, pretending to be a bumbling, doddering old wizard, but make sure that certain connections are made, and even that certain connections are not made when it's the wrong time. When Tasselhoff figures out what was really going on back when the Dragonlances were originally used, Fizban makes him forget because it's not quite time yet for that magic or that information to be out there. Your immortals could become the Gandalf or the Fizban of a mortal campaign. You can also do campaigns that are a mixture of the two. They talk about combinations. They talk about how to earn experience points as an immortal. How do you get PP? Immortals tend to have projects, various things that they do to nudge things in the direction that they want them to go, either for themselves or their sphere or both. And your charisma becomes important in setting up these projects because you kind of want the mortals to do it for you. So you have to be able to influence the mortals to do that sort of thing. The game suggests that you use the rules for strongholds and dominions to handle these projects. I think that's interesting, but I almost would have liked to have seen a set of rules specifically for this. I know there probably wasn't room. This book cuts off at, I believe, 52 pages. You could have expanded it to a 64 and added a little bit more for how these projects work. But I guess using the Dominion rules is close enough. So you get advice on exploration games, investigation games. You get a treatise on immortal justice. How are immortals brought to justice when they do something against the interests of the multiverse or against their own sphere or what have you? Basically, you get hauled up in front of a hierarch, and the hierarch becomes, the judge. There is no jury, and you have to prove your guilt or innocence against your accusers to the hierarch's satisfaction. And then whatever decision the hierarch makes sticks. The hierarch can remove power points or ability score points. They can basically chastise you pretty good and bust you down a couple of stripes. So that is something to remember, that the immortals do have their own system of keeping each other in line. Then we get into, holy crap, magic immortals can do. So we already looked at how you take mortal magic and cast it as an immortal. This is doing the sorts of things that are even beyond mortal magic. Create matter, moving matter, creating energy, creating water, destroying water, and much more than just a create food and water spell, but creating lakes or oceans, like doing the sorts of things that immortals can do. There's an incredible amount of flexibility here in these couple of pages that would allow the immortals with enough power points to do a whole lot, to almost anything, including picking some pet humans and boosting their ability scores. We get some more information on home planes. How planes can be moved within the cosmology of the multiverse. How you can access various planes from different points, how many power points it costs. And then we start talking about the bad guys, the sphere of entropy. What do entropy immortals do, and why do we oppose them? There's some talk about fighting other immortals, and how to do XP, PowerPoints, what the old... Remember that you used to get experience points based on the hit dice of your opponent, and if there were little asterisks after the hit dice, that was because the creature had a special ability. This tells you how to handle that for immortals, because, wow, special abilities. There are lots of them. You are adding asterisks by the 5s and 10s for these immortal creatures. So the experience point bonuses go through the roof. And of course, to measure that in power points, you divide it by 10,000. There's advice on planning your immortal adventures and exactly how many power points worth of stuff you want to hand out and what your immortal adventure should look like. These tables for rate of progress might remind you a little bit of, say, the way 3rd edition and 4th edition built in counters based on an experience point budget. How fast do you want your characters to advance? The middle of this book was a pull-out reference guide. You open the staples, you pull out all these tables, and you bend the staples back. Here's an Immortal character sheet, and you see that it's actually got 2 spots for forms listed so that you can fill out the 2 forms that your Immortal most often takes. You've also got 2 armor class tracks. Or I'm sorry, 2 hit roll tracks. My bad. The armor class is little numbers in the corners. Hit rolls, as you might imagine, are at the deep end of the pool. They are way far beyond what mortals are capable of. You can't really do like a THAC0 or a mathematical progression, because when you hit 20 needed to hit, the 20 repeats on the table. So it makes it difficult for you to just mathematically algorithm it. So we have the track, you fill in the track on the character sheet. Here we go with the super powerful creatures. Archons, which are super powerful lawful champions. You could almost squint and use them as angels. You've got these guardian obstructions, the back, that are created. They can block immortals. They're not really sentient as such, but they do have power points. There's the D word. Demons do appear here, and there are different types of demon. And they all have power points, so that they can all make those sort of attacks upon immortal characters. You can see there's several pages on demons, which sort of tells you by the focus that these are probably your default opponents of equivalent strength to your PC Immortals. And you get to the demon rulers, Orcus and Demogorgon. There they are. So all sorts of demons that you can throw at your players, how often they appear, what kind of followers they can summon. Diaboli from the Nightmare Dimension. And a number of other creatures of equivalent power. The fact that some of these creatures have ridiculous numbers of power points is just staggering. When you're thinking about what it is these characters and creatures can accomplish when they interact with the prime material plane, it's very different from the D&D you're used to. Of course, there is a Appendix N-like bibliography. And once again, we get the list of all the magical effects, their base costs. You go and multiply that by your sphere factor. And that's it for the Immortal DM's book. Wow. This one has gone on a little longer than my normal ones, but that's because there's a lot to talk about when Immortals are concerned. I almost wanted to break this up into 2 videos the way I did the red box. So if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with it. I know I've probably rambled a little bit, but I am truly blown away by what's been sitting under my nose all these years. You know, of course, I purchased the Immortals books. Our whole game club back in middle school and high school, prided ourselves on having all of the box sets. Sadly, my gold box has not survived all these years, but the books have. We just never played this far. As I said in a previous video, in one campaign, and it was one of our first campaigns when we were still middle schoolers and Monty Hall players and just wanted to kill everything and take all the treasure, we made it into the upper 20s. But I do not recall that we ever broke into the 30s. So this was just not a power level that any of my campaigns ever reached, even the ones that span multiple years. Now that I go back and look at it, I'm very intrigued by it, because it's a whole different game from D&D. So there it is, the Immortals book. How does it play? I don't know yet, but I do intend to find out. That's it for the Immortals. I am out of words for the evening. We will see you next time on the Old Dragoon when we talk about TSR's Indiana Jones role-playing game. Was it the worst role-playing game ever written, or was it actually pretty playable? Come back and find out. Remember, character is what you are in the dark. Good night, everyone.